So now we want to take a look at the income approach to value. We already talked about sales comparison, and that was the first of the three that we're going to talk about. The second one, again, is the income approach. Now, when it comes to the income approach, now there's two different methods that you can create or determine value based on the income. One is called capitalization approach. The other is called gross rent multiplier. And we're going to talk about both of those. And let me just go ahead and say right now, you need a calculator for this portion. So if you don't have a calculator, go ahead and hit pause or whatever and go get one, because you're going to need a calculator. You will need to know how to do some of this math. All right. So we're going to start out talking about capitalization, but one of the things you need to pay attention to on this slide, look, either one of these two methods, either capitalization or gross rent multiplier, either one you could use for whatever type property you're trying to determine the value for. Now, when I say the type property, obviously it needs to be an income producing property. If there's no income, then obviously the income approach to value will be of no use to you. Now, having said that, the capitalization approach that we're going to talk about first, that is much better for commercial type properties. But if you have like residential rental properties, which is very common, a lot of investors, own rental properties, then the best method for the residential properties is the gross rent multiplier. And I will tell you, that is something they could likely ask you just to make sure you understand these two methods. So again, capitalization is much better for commercial properties. Gross rent multiplier is much better for residential properties. So I would certainly keep that in mind. Okay, so again, we're going to start with capitalization. We got to figure this out. Now, there are some formulas that you probably just need to memorize. Okay, and as you watch this video, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to write these formulas down. We're fixing to do some sample math problems here. And if you have these formulas in front of you, this is going to help you a lot. But you need to just memorize these formulas. Now, you'll notice, and I've got the formulas, by the way, there's three of them here on this slide. But you notice that there's really just three components here. We're dealing with the net operating income, that's NOI. We're also dealing with something called the capitalization rate, and then we're dealing with value. Three components there. Well, obviously, if I know these formulas, and I know any two of the three, then there's no reason you shouldn't be able to figure out the third, right? For example, that first one, the first formula, is NOI, net income, divided by the capitalization rate will give you the value of the property. Now, if you think about this, it's pretty simple. And typically, if you're going to be doing this, trying to determine the value in this way, and it's an income producing property, what do you think is always the first thing I need to know about that property? What's the income? So if you're telling me it's an income producing property, then what's the income? That's typically the first thing I need to know, the net operating income. Now, once I know the net income, if I'm trying to figure out the value, then I just divide the cap rate, divide the net income by the cap rate, and that would give you the value of the property. Now, in some cases, they may not give you the cap rate. They may just tell you what the income of the property is and what the value of the property is, and then you have to figure out what's the cap rate. Well, again, pretty simple. Now you just take the net income, divide that by the value, and that will give you the cap rate. So in those first two formulas, you're always dividing, and you always start with the net income. You always divide the net income by either the cap rate or the value, and they have to give you one or one or the other. Okay, so that should be pretty easy right there. If they provide you with the net income, and typically they will, but in some cases they won't. We're getting ready to talk about that. You know you're always going to divide it by whatever they give you, either the cap rate or the value. Whatever they don't give you, obviously, is what they're going to be asking you to solve for. But if you look at that third formula, potentially they could give you the value of the property and provide you with what the cap rate is, and now you need to figure out what is the income. Now, if the question is asking for the income, then you're not going to be dividing. Now you're multiplying. And obviously you see there in that formula, value times the cap rate will give you the net operating income. So again, not much to those formulas, but again, I think, before we go any further, if you haven't already written those three down, you might want to write them down, because you need to memorize those, because I'm telling you, those formulas will not be provided to you on a test. So you get a question like one of the ones we're getting ready to go over, and you don't know the formula, that's where you could have a problem right there. So I've got like three examples here of questions they might ask or how they might ask them. So let's take a look at this. Here's number one. It says a property generates $90,000 in net income annually. And by the way, and I should have mentioned this in the previous slide, when we talk about income, that's always the annual income. Annual, not monthly or whatever. Now, potentially, they could give you a monthly income. And if they do, hopefully you already figured it out. You're going to have to multiply that monthly income by 12, because you have to have your annual income. And you need to pay attention to that in the question. Now, in this case, it says annual income, so we don't have to do anything with it. But if they give you a monthly income, divide it by 12, multiply it by 12. If they say you got a quarterly income, then obviously that means you got to multiply that by 4. But you've got to get your annual income before you can go any further. All right, so we know the annual income is $90,000. The cap rate is 6%. What's the value of the property? Well, again, if you have that formula, and it should be pretty simple here, your income, which says 90,000, divided by the cap rate, 6%, what is the value? And by the way, let me point this out to you as well. I don't know what kind of calculator you're using or looking at, but this is where a lot of people just don't know how to work a calculator. I don't think. Especially when we start dealing with percentages. Do I have to convert that 6% into a decimal? Well, potentially, but most calculators have a percent key on it. Look on your calculator. Does it have a key that has the percent sign? And if it does, then in your calculator, just hit the number 6 and then the percent side, and the calculator does all the work for you. You don't have to worry about converting it to a decimal. But if for some reason you've got an antique calculator and it doesn't have the percent side, then you will have to convert it to 0.06, right? Otherwise, so you would put 90,000 in your calculator, 90,000 divided by 6, and then hit the percent key, and that should give you the answer. And in this case, looks like the answer is $1,500,000, so $1.5 million in value. Okay, it's pretty easy. Especially if you know that cap rate. The cap rate, the formula to figure this out, and and I put the formula there on the slide again. The net income divided by the cap rate. That would give you the value. So y'all, that should be pretty simple right there. All right, now let's look at another one. The second question, an office building is valued at $2 million and the current cap rate is 5.5%. What is the net operating income? So this time they're actually asking for the income. So if they don't provide the income, remember, you don't divide. You have to now multiply, right? So what did they give me? So I know the value is 2 million. So if I put that in my calculator, times 5.5 and then the percent key, or if you're going to convert it to a decimal, I think it's what, 0.055. But I think you'll find if you just use the percent key on the calculator, God made things a whole lot easier with this calculator, that's for sure. But anyway, what answer did you come up with? Hopefully you decided the answer was A, $110,000. Y'all, 2 million times the 5.5%, that gives you $110,000 in net income. Okay. All right, so let's do one more. Getting used to these calculators. An investor wants a 10% return. Y'all, that's the capitalization. When they talk about a return on their investment, y'all, they're talking about the capitalization. So we know the cap rate's going to be 10% on a property that generates $75,000 in annual net income. So y'all, so in this case, they gave us the income. So now, if we got the income, we're always going to divide. So net income, 75,000 divided by, y'all, what did they give you to divide it by? The cap rate, which is 10%. And then that should tell you what price the investor would be willing to pay. So 75,000 divided by 10%, what'd you come up with? Hopefully you came up with 750,000. Okay. Y'all, it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. Again, if you remember those three very short, easy formulas, regardless of the question, you shouldn't have any issues here. Now, let me say this too, before I go any further. It is possible that in the question they don't tell you exactly what the net income is. Okay. Y'all, what they might take. Now, first of all, let's make sure we understand this. Y'all, is there a difference between the net operating income and the gross income? You bet it is. So why does that matter? First of all, gross income is not going to help you here when you're trying to do this math. All this math is based on net income. So again, net would be the gross, y'all, that's how much you actually made minus all your expenses. Okay? So, for example, they might tell you, they make $5,000 a month in gross income, or might even give you the annual gross income. But if they give you the gross income, then they have to also tell you what all the expenses are. So you'd have to do some more math, calculate what all the expenses are, subtract all the expenses from your gross income, and then that leaves you with your net income. And then once you know the net income, then it's easy from that point. Hopefully they won't do that to you, but potentially they could. So I just want to make you aware of that. Just calculate what all the expenses are, subtract it from the annual gross income. Then you've got your net income and you're ready to do business. Exactly what we've just done. Now, so how would this actually work in the real world? If I was looking at listing a commercial property, for example, and I'm trying to figure out the value of this property. So how does this actually work? That's what we want to look at right now. We want to look at an example of using the cap rate. We obviously, and I know I've already touched on this, but if I'm trying to figure out the value of this property I'm getting ready to list, and it's an income producing property, it's commercial property, what do you think the first thing I want to know about that property would be? What's the income? And again, what type? Net. Y'all want to know what is your annual net income. And where would I get that from? I would try it from the owner. If the owner does not know what his income is, you probably need to just pass and move on anyway. So, the owner needs to give you accurate information and make sure they know that anything you produce is based on the information they provided. But, let's say the owner says that my net operating income is $150,000 per year. That's my net income. Well, obviously, to figure out the value of this property, I'm going to need to know the cap rate. What is the cap rate for this market or for this area? Well, the way you would do that is very similar to the sales, to the sales comparison approach. Now I need to find a similar property, comparable property that has recently sold, in this area. And let's say I find a comparable property, and once a property is sold, this information becomes public information. So you can look this up in the public records, the tax records or whatever. And what I know about that comparable property, I know the net income was $185,000. I know it sold for $1,850,000. If I know those two things, shouldn't I be able to figure out what the cap rate is for that property? Remember the formula. Net income divided by the value, and that would give you the cap rate. So $185,000 divided by $1,850,000, that gives me a cap rate of 10%. Right? So now I know what the cap rate is for this market. All I got to do now is plug that into my subject property. So now I know, again, from my subject property, again, my net income is $150,000. The cap rate for this market is 10%. Well, to figure out the value, again, is net income, $150,000, divided by the cap rate, in this case 10%. I now know the value of my subject property is $1.5 million. That's all there is to it. So really the main thing you need to really memorize here are these formulas. Three formulas. It shouldn't be very difficult there. Because when you get questions, they're not going to provide the formulas to you in the question. So, it should be pretty easy. If they give you or provide you the income in the question, you're always going to do what? Divide. If they're asking you what the income is, because they don't provide the income, then you're going to have to multiply. Just that simple. So, that's your capitalization approach to value.